Hi Dragonflies! Here are some tips for reviving dried up watercolor paint. The first tip has to do with adding new paint to your palette when you have some dried up paint already in the well. Some paints get kind of crumbly when they're really dry. If I just add new color in this well without doing anything about those crumbly bits, they may get trapped in the new color. I won't know that they're there. They won't get fully mixed. And when I go to make a brush stroke, that solid piece of paint is going to make a big streak across my painting. So to prevent that problem, here's what I do with those crumbly paints before I add some new color to the well. I start by flooding that palette well with water. This will help those crumbly bits to start to soften up, but the main reason I'm doing this is to remove any contaminants. This well has a little blue in it from some greens that I was mixing. Then I'll just use my brush to very gently remove that blue contaminating color from the surface, and then use my brush like an eyedropper to lift off the extra water and any of those contaminating colors before I add new color to this well. If you have the kind of palette that has wells around the perimeter of a mixing surface, you can actually do this quicker with your spray bottle, and I put a link to the video that shows how to do that in the article that goes with this video. Now, before I add any new paint, I want to dissolve all those little crumbles and get the paint that's in the well back to a nice smooth consistency so I won't have any unpleasant surprises. So I'm going to add a little water, just a drop or two of clean water at a time. Working those crumbles out a little at a time works better than adding a lot of water and then you can't see where the little crumbles are. The tool I'm using here is a palette knife. A palette knife might or might not fit into the wells of your palette. If your palette wells are too small for a palette knife, another great tool for this is a glass stirring rod. You can order these online very inexpensively. Or you might have some other item around your house that would work. The main goal is to break up those chunks and smash them down so that you can mix them back with the water and get this paint nice and smooth again. Occasionally you'll run into a color where it feels like instead of softening up, you've just broken it down into littler chunks. It's almost like there's sand in the mixture. If it feels like you've got little granules of sand in there, then you might need to employ another trick, and that's to warm things up. So I usually do this to multiple palette wells at the same time, so I'm going to start by adding some water to all the wells where I want to soften up my paint and get it back to a nice consistency. And then I'm going to cover or close my palette and put it on a heating pad. I turn my heating pad to high and go away for half an hour or an hour. If you have a really lightweight palette and you're concerned about the plastic maybe warping, you can definitely do this at a lower temperature, maybe leave it for a little longer period of time. After half an hour or an hour, you can give it another try and see if it's softened up. In most cases, you'll find that now those little chunks feel a little softer. You can feel them starting to break up again. So now if I take a little of this paint and put it out on my palette, I think you can see, maybe not, I can definitely feel that all those little crunchy bits are gone, and this is back to the same consistency it would be as it came out of the tube. If you're working with a stickier paint, it might stick to your palette knife or whatever else you're using to remix it. And if that happens, it works well to just use a needle or a paper clip to scrape off that color and drop it back in the well so that you can get another attempt at dissolving it. In this case, there was enough paint still in that palette well that I don't even feel like I need to add any more. But I do need to add some color to the yellow well in this travel palette, so I can talk about some of the wrinkles that happen when the palette's really small. So I'm going to mist it a little bit to add just a tiny bit of water instead of putting in a whole droplet, which might be too much. And I'm using my paper clip now as my stirring stick, but this paint is pretty sticky and it sticks to the paper clip. So it helps to take a second pointy object and use both of them to work against each other to break up the little blobs or chunks that you have in the paint. I can feel that I still need more water, but I think the spray bottle would be overkill, so I'm going to use my pointy object to just bring a few really small drops over at a time. Okay, I think that paint is nice and smooth now, and we can add some more. Adding more paint leaves a little blob or kind of a peak on the top. So I'm going to use my pointy object again to take care of that. And all I need to do is just dip it in water so that the pointy object itself is wet. It's bringing just a little water in. And then I can just gently stir it with that pointy object and the paint will even out. This works in larger palette wells also, so let's go ahead and add some paint to that yellow well. And you can see we've got kind of a blob, and again I can just dip my pointy object in water and stir it just in little circles, and that blob will be incorporated into the rest of the paint and the whole thing will level out very nicely. Now, if you're thinking that's way too much work, I would never do that with my palette, and you might not need to. If you paint often enough, you might never get to that crumbly stage, or you might not be using any paints that have that tendency. So take this and use it if it's helpful for you, and otherwise ignore it. If you paint long enough, though, you're likely to run into this next problem, and that's paint that's gotten rock hard in the tube, or just hard enough that you can't squeeze it out. So the method of last resort is to cut the tube open to get the paint out and then transfer it into another container. Kathy Weller has already made a great YouTube video on how to do that and all the things you might encounter, so I'm going to link to that video below this one. Instead, I'm going to talk about something you can try that might allow you to rescue the situation without having to resort to cutting the tube open. This works best with tubes of paint that aren't terribly old, but it's worth trying first with any tube of paint before you cut it open. So we're going to use heat again. I'm going to take this tube of paint and put it in a bowl that can tolerate boiling water. And then I'm going to cover the tube completely with boiling water. It would actually be better if I used a larger bowl or maybe a Pyrex measuring cup or a coffee mug, something that would hold a larger volume of water and stay hot longer, but this is what looked like it would show up well on the video. And now we'll go away for 4 or 5 minutes and see if that worked to soften things up. Now I'm going to use a pair of pliers to take it out so that I don't burn my fingers, and dry it off with a towel. This is cool enough to hold, I think, but if it's not, you can put it in the towel and squeeze it to feel if it's softening up, and it actually is. There's still a little bit of a hard plug right at the top, so what I'm going to do is see if I can get a little water inside the tube too to help to revive the paint at the top. I could just leave it in there with the cap off, but I could tell from feel that there was a section at the top that was about 1/8 of an inch thick that felt pretty hard still. So I'm going to take my paper clip and poke a hole down through the middle to help the water migrate a little farther down into the paint. And then we'll just let it sit in the hot water. Since my bowl is small, I've actually also replenished my hot water with fresh hot water. When I checked it after a couple of minutes, it's softer, but still probably too hard to squeeze out. So I'm going to make a few more holes, and you can see that the paint is softening up inside the tube. So I think one more time in the hot water bath, and we might actually be able to squeeze the paint out of this tube. All right, let's give it a try. It's definitely softened up enough that I can start to squeeze it out, but it's kind of a challenge to do it with my hands. So since I happen to have a tube squeezer, I'm going to use the tube squeezer to help me out. And yes, we can now squeeze it out. It still feels pretty stiff, so I think I would probably put it back in the hot water bath again. but I'm pretty confident with a few more rounds through the hot water and a little patience, we'll be able to get this paint back to a squeezable consistency and not have to cut open the tube. However, something I should have mentioned at the beginning, usually doing this process means I'm going to be sacrificing the label. I don't know if you can tell, but the label is starting to fall off this tube. So it's a good idea to write down the label information so that you can take a piece of masking tape and relabel it for yourself. So you want to be sure to write down the manufacturer's name, the brand of paint that you're using, their color name, their name for this color, and the pigment code or codes for this paint. Those are the little tiny, tiny numbers that you need a magnifying glass to read. And it would have been much better if I had gotten that information off the label before I destroyed it, because the whole reason for writing down the pigment codes is that, especially with older paints, sometimes pigments become unavailable or a better pigment comes along, and paint manufacturers have to change the formulation of their paint. There's not a whole lot you can do about it if you have an older tube of paint and you buy the same color and the pigments have changed, but it's just good to know so that you can be cautious and test it to make sure you don't have to make some adjustments to get that color to blend with whatever you've used the previous color for. So I had to sacrifice the label, but not the tube, and I've squeezed all the air out, so hopefully it won't get hard again. But if it does, you can repeat this process as many times as you like. And if all else fails, you can cut the tube open, find another container, and reconstitute it that way. This method takes a little patience, maybe replenishing that hot water more than once, working a little more water into the tube, but it's well worth it if you're talking about a tube that's mostly full like this one, or a tube of an expensive pigment like one of the cobalt pigments. So I hope this helps you rescue some of your dried up paint and not waste paint, and maybe also not have to go through the messy process of cutting open a tube to get at the paint. See you next time. Happy painting.